Hello and welcome to SFDC Sessions for the week of May 25th. I'm Elisa Carroll, Editor-in-Chief of Henry Magazine. This week we continue to bring our 2020 issue to life, which focuses on the intersection of design and nature. And today we are delving into the magical groves and hidden gardens of botanical history. Now, flora and plant life have always figured largely in the history of interior design, and today we're so privileged to feature three voices, three incredible creatives who are helping to bring that legacy into the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Dara Caponigro, the editor, writer, and creative director of Schumacher, Pamela Marshall, Vice President of Design at Schumacher, and Rachel Doriss, Vice President and Design Director of Pollack. As always, our thanks to the San Francisco Design Center and Rhonda Harada for giving us this platform for discovery and exploration. So Dara, good morning. I'd love to start with you if you don't mind. You had shared that in creating Schumacher's new classics collection, there was a really wonderful story about Baudin butterfly, and it really encapsulated, I think, the intersection of textile history, natural science, and women artists that we're discussing today. And I wondered if you would mind sharing that story with us.
No, not at all. So every January we launch a collection called Schumacher Classics, and it's a collection where we delve into the archives and we bring back beautiful, products that from long ago. And Schumacher has an amazing archive. It's one of the largest privately held archives in the United States. And Pam and I always have a field day going in every year. And we try to theme the collection every year. So this year we themed it to the natural world. And we came across this document that was either a late 18th or early 19th century document of butterflies that just blew our minds. And we created a chintz around that document. It's basically a dead ringer for the original, except that we changed the colors. But it was interesting because we were in the studio in New York and the director of the Neue Gallery came through and she said, "Oh, that looks just like Maria Sibylla Marion's work." And we were like, "Really?" And we looked her up. She said, "Look her up online." So we did. And lo and behold, that pattern was identical to one of her illustrations. So what was so fun was that here was a pattern that we did in the 21st century. In the 21st century, right? That was that was based on a 17th century illustration that had been reinterpreted in the 19th century. So it was this wonderful, journey of how this one design had popped up, along the history of time. And I'm sure it's popped up many other times too, who knows, but it was a really fun coincidence.
Isn't that beautiful? It's sort of like a passing of the torch, but perhaps a little unknowingly, but her work continues through your work now, which is so glorious.
Yeah.
And Pam, I wondered if you could share a little bit about her and all of the elements that you saw in that pattern.
Well, I mean, just like Dara said, upon seeing the pattern itself, I mean, we have many beautiful botanicals in our archives. We have such an extensive archive, but there was something just so that captured us with this one particular design. It had that very scientific element, even though it was very beautiful. And it also sort of gave it an edge and it made it cool. And it was a really unique route in, just coming to this design. Like usually we know every single thing about a document, which we knew the date and sort of, where it had come from. But then with the director of the Neue Gallery coming through, kind of backtracking and giving us the information on this illustrator who in and of herself was such a pioneer. She was the first woman to be cataloging things in this way. And it just made us really proud to sort of carry that forward. And then for the design itself, just how relevant it was for today, through motif, but also through color. And I had mentioned that, there was some section of it that reminded me a little bit of like a 1980s Christian Lacroix type of thing. And we colored it in that way. We colored it in a traditional way. And it really carried color in such a fantastic way and, gave it a lot of different personalities.
Right. And one of the things I'm sure so many people have shared with you is that there was this beautiful continuity, or rather authenticity of line that seemed to come through that drew me immediately to the collection. And I know you were really rigorous about respecting the original artist's work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's true with anything that we derive from a document. Is we really want to keep the authenticity of the original artist's mark, and also, whatever the original production method was. So are very careful, right down to every single detail, when our artists in the studio are working on things, and creating new elements to fit in with these documentary things, that they pay attention to what it was originally drawn with, how it was originally drawn, and carrying that mark forward.
That respect and that rigor is so impressive and so appreciated. Thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you.
Such a beautiful, intriguing fabric. And, Rachel, it's just a beautiful thing, isn't it, when you see kind of this energy or this consciousness among the creative community that draws us all towards a similar thing. And Rachel, last year you debuted Nature Lab, your collection, that features a really pictorial sort of specimen-like fabric alongside a collection of others that reflect natural surfaces. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could share your story of how you were drawn to create this botanical print.
Well, first of all, I think that there's oftentimes a collective unconsciousness that's happening in the universe. So you have an idea and you see it kind of out there in the world. And it doesn't just have to do with the internet. But for the Fabric Nature Lab, it has an interesting story. We're primarily weavers, and we work with mills all over the world, and they show us some of their fabrics. And this one embroidery mill in India showed us this fabric that had the most detailed embroidered samurai warriors. And it was beautiful and had so much spirit, and there was so much detail in the stitches. I didn't want to do samurai warriors. I wanted to do our own idea, but I was trying to think of something that was beautiful and decorative, but interesting and kind of quirky. So we started thinking about scientific botanical posters. I've always been drawn to like medical posters, but I don't think that that's pretty enough for our market. So we were thinking, what about if we focused on these natural elements, but really like scientists, where we were like getting in there, spending time and looking at these specimens and then creating a fabric from that. So the process, we started looking at beautiful books of botanical paintings, and I never really even considered where the artists came from. So that's really interesting to hear Schumacher's take on that. But we don't have a set of archives, so we decided let's become our own painters and create our own documents. So we went to the Rhode Island School of Design, where I went to school, and they have a place called the Nature Lab, which is basically a natural history tiny museum, a cabinet of curiosities where the students can go and study from objects from nature. So we visited the Nature Lab and we took photographs and did paintings, and that's where we really got our information from. So it was very much like a science-focused type thing.
That just sounds like the most delicious experience. Can you share a little bit about what it felt like to be in that lab?
Well, it's like a library. It's quiet. You know, when you go into a library, especially an old one, the air changes and you're not so, vibrating with all of technology, right? Things change and you
Yes.
can be quiet and study. So it's a way to connect with real life things. So looking and touching and taking time. And so one of my designers, she was the one who really worked on all of the paintings, and she pretty much spent the better part of the summer working on them. So it wasn't like this rush project, let's get it out to market. It was like really taking our time. And I think that kind of relates back to the original artists that created the archives and the botanicals. You know, it takes so much time and study. You can't just be like a good artist. You have to have that detail and appreciate what you're looking at.
Yes. And what a privilege to be able to spend that time, right, and to really dig in and focus on that.
Yeah.
Dara, may I ask you, you have a pattern in your collection called Cabot it's an exquisite piece that was named for Francis Cabot, the founder of the Garden Conservancy. So you obviously were attuned to that sensibility as well. Could you share a little bit about what attracted you to that?
Sure. So it's a pattern actually that we created from scratch, but using old engravings. So, and what's really fun about that pattern, so it has lots of different plant specimens on it, but we had this idea to do it in 2 different scales. So we did one kind of oversized where the plants are maybe 18 inches tall, and then we did one smaller where the plants are maybe 8 inches tall. So each pattern is good for different applications. Each pattern is good for different applications, but what's so cool about the big one is that it almost feels modern. You know, you have these beautiful engravings of these botanicals, but blown up, they take on a completely different quality.
Yes, yes. And Pam, you said it's quite rare that you do 2 different scales of paper, but you had these, were they single plate illustrations that you both kind of wanted to see at a large scale?
Yes. So within our archives, we had tons of single plate botanical illustrations, and one was more amazing than the next. It was really hard to narrow down which ones we were going to include. But the designer in our studio who worked on this, we sort of went through all of them and tried to keep the ones, although they were all interesting and beautiful, that had something that really resonated, either like an intricate patterning in the flower itself. And we're also really careful just not to eliminate any of these like weird kinds of things that get included in these illustrations, like bulbs or roots or things like that. So keeping all of those, natural parts of the flowers, instead of just focusing on like, it just has to be pretty. It still is pretty, but it's also interesting.
And don't you feel that pattern has such a magnetism, right? I feel very, intrigued by it because, as you said, you were so careful to create with the perfect pen and the perfect line mark what felt right for that particular kind of illustration.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also by doing that in the large scale in particular, there's still like this magical lightness about it. It didn't become like these overbearing heavy things. It really executed beautifully.
Right, right. Well, may I ask actually, and this is just continuing our conversation about the natural sciences, Dara, I was really intrigued to discover that you minored in biology.
I did.
Right, and you got quite a good grade, I think, in your plant sciences class.
I did. A plus.
A plus. So what as a writer, what do you find so intriguing about the natural world? What was your original entry point into that space? Did you read Thoreau? Was it something in your environment?
No, I can attribute it to my dad. So, my dad's a doctor and my mom's an interior designer. So I always had the yin yang of the creative side and then the more scientific side. And I toyed for a long time with going to medical school, but the arts won out. But I've always been, he's been a lover of nature. Since a little girl, I was out there gardening and taking hikes with him. And I don't know, it was really his influence. So I really appreciate nature.
What a beautiful combination. And I love all your sort of natural objects behind you too. I see your white corals and all of those.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't do it on purpose. There's a lot of natural stuff in my house.
You're in the cabinet of curiosity of your own. Yes. And obviously Rachel and Pam, as textile designers, you're rooted in the natural world with your study of fibers, both plant and animal. And I wondered if you could share how working with those materials and those processes inspire you. Rachel, do you mind starting?
Sure. Well, as woven textile designers, the fiber and the yarn is the material that we're working with. So the beginning process always starts with the material. And the specific fiber really guides me for color and end use and kind of spirit of pattern, if there is a pattern. For example, if I'm working with alpaca, I'm going to go for more natural alpaca colors. A hot pink alpaca, I don't think would look as luxurious as just the natural color. So fiber is always really helping me with color. And then certainly I'm thinking about how fabrics will be used at the very beginning. So whether it's residential or commercial or window or luxury throw fabric. So the fiber really is it's from the very beginning.
Right, right. And part of the webinar that I enjoyed most were all of your, obviously your sheep slides.
Yes, thank you. The hand shearing.
Yes, that Irish shearer was impressive. He was using, shears, not
real scissors.
electronic equipment. Yeah.
I actually tried it. So I visited the west coast of Connemara and visited a sheep farm. And this guy, he was a 4th generation farmer, and he had dogs with the special whistles to do different patterns. But anyway, his hands were soft as a baby's, and so I got to actually use the shears, and it was really cool. Yeah, so I love fiber. I think Pam, you had mentioned earlier that you're a fiber nerd and a fiber lover.
It is true. I term myself a textile nerd all the time. So yeah, I guess that's a good thing in this space, but
Absolutely.
Very similarly, the fiber is the starting point. And, we'll be looking at a design, and sometimes it's just artwork. And once we've decided, okay, we're going to execute this as a woven, what fiber you use really drastically changes the personality of what that design will be, also taking into consideration the end use. But then further to that, it's also the mills that we work with. And we partner with very special mills in that we want to work with people who are as passionate about what they're doing as we are about what we're doing,
Yes.
And really put their hearts into it. We look at our mills as partners and not just manufacturers. And even though Schumacher has sort of like the feeling of like a big name, we're really not a huge company, and we do things in very special artisanal ways. So we're not looking to produce 10,000 yards of fabric at a time. We're looking for still hand weavers or places that can execute very uncommon processes. So the process plays a huge role in what we do with the fibers.
Right, right. And you had mentioned, Rachel, too, how when you were working with the mill in India, you were looking at which stitches would be most appropriate for which part of the floral specimen or the botanical specimen, right?
Yeah, so I never followed that up earlier. So the resulting fabric, Nature Lab, is an embroidery. So the starting point for me was the quality of the stitch. I didn't just want to create the motif. I wanted to fill in the motif with interesting stitches and almost like patterns within each motif. So, there's a beautiful fern, but within each fern leaf, there's a little herringbone that's happening with the stitches. So it's you create the actual items or the motifs that are painted, but then you're putting more pattern inside of it. So that's where it really becomes something different when it's a textile. And we even had an evolution of one of the motifs, which was this fern. So it started out with the real life fern, then it went to the gouache painting, then it went to the embroidery. Then we photographed the embroidered fern and we did it as a print in our most recent collection, which is called Frond. And what's so interesting about Frond is that it's so far removed from the original fern, it has a different hand, because at that point it's the embroidery that's doing the drawing. So it's not just taking something and then printing it. And that's what we rarely actually do prints, but when we do, there's something that's non-print about it. So that's where the embroidery stitches come in. And the mill in India, they have their own designers who are really helping to engineer the stitches, and we rely on their technical expertise as well. So there's a whole collaboration with a set of designers and manufacturers that's part of the development process.
Right. Those collaborations, I would imagine, are really fulfilling and processes of discovery that are rewarding. And that's a word that kept coming up for each of you when we were talking. Wonder, the opportunity to discover in your work, that is one of the things that drives you. And Dara, I wanted to ask, as we start to close, obviously in your role as a magazine founder, as an editor-in-chief, as a creative director, part of your gift, right, and your role is to kind of have those antenna out for what you're feeling as Rachel put it, in the collective unconscious, in the zeitgeist. And I wondered if you were feeling that when you started to conceptualize this nature-based collection, and if I may add on, what you're kind of feeling now for your next collection.
Well, let me just think. I mean, you know, the collection came out of a conversation that I had with Mish Twarkowski. I don't know if you know him, but he's a jewelry designer. Lovely guy, and he's on the board at the New York Botanical Garden. And we were at dinner, and he was talking about the Botanical Garden and how they have a scientific arm there that I had no idea about. So I live in the Bronx. I've been to the Botanical Gardens many, many times, but they have a building there that's just dedicated to science, and they have field workers all around the world who are discovering plants to this day, you know? So it's this very vital part of the garden that a lot of people are unaware of. And it got me thinking about this idea of discovery. And, you know, we're also jaded with Instagram, and it's very hard, I mean, even as a magazine editor, to present people with things that they hadn't heard of before or seen before. I mean, my litmus test of a good magazine is if there's one thing in there that I could be surprised by, it's done its job, especially in this day and age. So I started to think about the idea of discovery, and the idea that it's still possible to discover things. And that really excited me. And that was kind of the backstory of the collection, you know, just this idea of that discovery is still possible. And then in terms of what we've got cooking, we're always cooking up something. So we have collections that launch every single month. And one of the things that we have coming is a collection that's based on, it's called Rive Gauche, and it's based on Yves Saint Laurent, and it's very sexy, and it's filled with animal and paisleys and things like that. So we're super excited about that. But there's a lot coming up. And right now I'm kind of thinking that red might be next. You know, I think that people are really into being cozy, and those classic kind of clubby rooms might be coming back, but who knows?
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you. And then Rachel, you were sharing that the launch of your next collection is coming up, right? And it's a kind of a 180 from the natural world. It's more of a machined world, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So our collection is called Icon. And besides frond, that has the fern, there are no drawn lines in it. It is all very machined. It's almost like laser cut looking. There are some deco elements. And color is really driving a lot of the fabrics. There's some really rich colors, as if you're looking at the colors in candlelight. You know, there's like a shadowy kind of depth. So there's like an aubergine and a very deep gold color. And navies within that collection. So it's also, there's a bit of glamour in there, but also a bit of sort of warmth and like quiet in the natural fibers that we've used, like beautiful, luxurious wool boucle that you just want to cozy up with. And that you'll see that in coming through the rest of this year and early 2021. And we actually do 2 collections a year. So we do a spring and a fall collection like fashion. So right now I'm percolating ideas for spring 2022. Wow. So it's like way in the future.
Right. But maybe what both of you are sensing is this need, once perhaps we do come out of shelter in place, to hold on to that feeling of shelter and comfort and intimacy that, that we all hopefully can retain after we're back into the modern world.
Yeah.
So
one thing that I've noticed in this like quarantine is I'm not rushing around. In New York, I feel like I'm rushing from one thing to the next, and like working and groceries and picking up my kid from school. It's like it never stops. And I know that that's part of working and living in the city, but I do want to maintain a little bit of like quiet and less rushing and being home. So I think that hopefully we'll have some will enjoy some of the value that comes out with the silver linings of the situation and bring it into our homes.
Pam, may I ask you a final question? You know, as we started out our conversation today, we talked about this history of, you know, female artists and of natural history and science. And I wondered, as you were creating this collection, if you felt that beautiful sense of connection to that history or that lineage?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially after kind of like, you know, backtracking to Bodan Butterfly, and, you know, the origin that it was in somebody's sketchbook, you know, for scientific reasons. But I think just what it all comes down to is, you know, the science-based botanical. It just made me think about curiosity in general. And I think that curiosity is a really important element to design in general, because I think it's what keeps things moving forward. And if you are, you know, an artist, I think you inherently have to continue being curious, because once you become complacent, you become stagnant and there's nothing new. And there's always something new or some new version of something old or whatever it is, but just maintaining that curiosity.